versus blue. Ronaldo versus Messi. Red versus blue. Come on, friends. Ronaldo versus Messi. Red versus blue. Let's go. Ronaldo versus Messi. Red versus blue. Blue. Red versus blue. Ronaldo versus Messi.
Subscribe my channel.
Red versus blue. Ronaldo versus Messi. Let's go, friends. Let's go. Come on. Versus Messi. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Subscribe my channel. Ronaldo wins. Red wins. Ronaldo versus Messi. Come on, friends. Red versus blue. Ronaldo versus Messi. Neymar versus Messi. Versus Messi. Ronaldo versus Messi. Neymar versus Messi. Red versus blue. Let's go. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Messi. Red versus blue. Red points. Neymar versus Messi. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Messi. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Messi. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Neymar and Messi. Neymar versus Messi. Neymar versus Erling Haaland. Neymar versus Erling Haaland. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Erling Haaland. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Erling Haaland. Red versus blue. Red points. Neymar versus Erling Haaland. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Erling Haaland. Red points. Neymar versus Erling Haaland. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Haaland. Come on, friends. Blue points. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Erling Haaland. Red versus blue. Subscribe to Erling Haaland. Subscribe Neymar. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Erling Haaland. Neymar wins. Red versus blue. Subscribe. Neymar versus Mbappe. Neymar versus Kylian Mbappe. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Kylian Mbappe. Neymar versus Kylian Mbappe. Neymar good performance. Neymar versus Kylian Mbappe. Red versus blue. Let's go. Let's go. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Kylian Mbappe. Red versus blue. Versus blue. Red points. Neymar good performance. Red versus blue. Kylian Mbappe points. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Neymar. Subscribe Neymar. Red versus blue. Blue points. Red versus blue. Let's go. Come on, friends. Red versus blue. Blue. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Kylian Mbappe. Neymar versus Kylian Mbappe. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Neymar and Kylian Mbappe. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Neymar versus Mbappe. Kylian Mbappe wins. What a performance. Kylian Mbappe wins. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Vinicius versus Kylian Mbappe. Vinicius Jr. versus Kylian Mbappe. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Jr. versus Kylian Mbappe. Vinicius versus Mbappe. Red versus blue. Let's go. Start. Versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus blue. Red versus Mbappe. Red points. Vinicius Jr. points. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus Kylian Mbappe. Red versus blue. Come on, friends. Vinicius Jr. versus Kylian Mbappe. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Kylian Mbappe versus red versus blue. Kylian Mbappe versus Vinicius Jr. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. wins. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus James Rodriguez. Red versus blue. Let's go. Vinicius Jr. versus Rodriguez. Vinicius Jr. versus James Rodriguez. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Let's go. Started. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. James Rodriguez versus Vinicius Jr. Red points. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus Rodriguez. Vinicius Jr. versus Rodriguez. Vinicius Jr. versus Rodriguez. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus Rodriguez. Vinicius Jr. performance. Come on, friends. Jr. versus Rodriguez. Vinicius Jr. good performance. Come on, friends. Vinicius Jr. versus Rodriguez. Come on, friends. Vinicius Jr. wins. James Rodriguez versus Vinicius Jr. Vinicius Jr. wins. Next player, come here. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus Ronaldinho. Vinicius Jr. versus Ronaldinho. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus Ronaldinho. Vinicius Jr. versus Ronaldinho. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus Ronaldinho. Red versus blue. Ronaldinho score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Ronaldinho score. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus Ronaldinho. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus Ronaldinho. Red versus blue. Ronaldinho versus Vinicius Jr. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Let's go. Come on, friends. Red versus blue. Ronaldinho versus Vinicius Jr. Vinicius Jr. score. Red versus blue. Come on. Vinicius Jr. score. Vinicius Jr. versus Ronaldinho. Red versus blue. Ronaldinho versus Vinicius Jr. Red versus blue. Ronaldinho versus Vinicius Jr. Red versus blue. Ronaldinho versus Vinicius Jr. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. wins. Vinicius Jr. wins. Red versus blue. Next player, Vinicius Jr. versus Robert Lewandowski. Vinicius Jr. versus Robert Lewandowski. Vinicius versus Lewandowski. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Lewandowski versus Vinicius Jr. Red versus blue. Come on, friends. Let's go. Start. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. score. Red versus blue. Lewandowski versus Vinicius Jr. Red versus blue. Lewandowski score. Red versus blue. Come on, friends. Let's go. Red versus blue. Blue score. Lewandowski score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Lewandowski score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. versus Lewandowski. Lewandowski score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Vinicius Jr. score. 4-2. Lewandowski 4. Vinicius Jr. 2. Red versus blue. Come on, friends. Lewandowski wins. Vinicius Jr. Lewandowski wins. Next player. Come on, friends. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Karim Benzema versus Lewandowski. Benzema versus Lewandowski. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Lewandowski versus Benzema. Come on, friends. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Benzema score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Benzema score. Red versus blue. Benzema versus Lewandowski. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Lewandowski score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Lewandowski score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Lewandowski versus Benzema. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Benzema score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Lewandowski score. Red versus blue. Versus blue. Lewandowski versus Benzema. Red versus blue. Benzema score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Karim Benzema wins. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Karim Benzema wins. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Next player. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Benzema versus Ramos. Red score. Benzema score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Benzema score. Red versus blue. Benzema score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Benzema versus Ramos. Benzema score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Benzema versus Ramos. Red versus blue. Benzema score. Karim Benzema wins. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Karim Benzema versus Gavi. Spanish player Gavi. Karim Benzema versus Gavi. Red versus blue. Karim Benzema versus Gavi. Benzema versus Gavi. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Benzema versus Gavi. Benzema versus Gavi. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Gavi versus Benzema. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Gavi score. Red versus blue. Blue scores. Gavi score. Red versus blue. Benzema versus Gavi. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Blue score. Gavi scores. Red versus blue. Benzema versus Gavi. Benzema score. Gavi versus Benzema. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Gavi wins. Benzema versus Gavi. Gavi wins. Karim Benzema versus Gavi. Next players come here. Angel Di Maria versus Gavi. Angel Di Maria versus Gavi. Red versus blue. Gavi. Red versus Gavi. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Gavi. Red score. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Gavi. Red versus blue. Let's go. D score. Red versus blue. Di Maria score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Gaby. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Di Maria scores. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Gaby. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Gaby. Red versus blue. Blue score. Red versus blue. Di Maria score. Red versus blue. Di Maria wins. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Next player. Red versus blue. Blue. Di Maria versus Egyptian player. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Msala versus Maria. Msala versus Di Maria. Versus blue. Red versus blue. Msala versus Di Maria. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Msala versus Di Maria. Red versus blue. 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 Msala versus Di Maria. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Msala. Di Maria score. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Msala. Di Maria versus Msala. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Msala. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Msala versus Di Maria. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Msala. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Msala versus Di Maria. Di Maria wins. Red versus blue. Come on, friends. Next match. Red versus blue. Next player. Eden Hazard versus Di Maria. Eden Hazard versus Di Maria. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Hazard. Hazard versus Di Maria. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Hazard. Di Maria versus M. Salah. Di Maria versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Hazard. Come on, friends. Di Maria versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Subscribe. Di Maria versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Di Maria score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Come on, friends. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Hazard. Di Maria versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Come on, friends, like red versus blue and subscribe my channel. Red versus blue. Come on, friends, like red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Di Maria versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Hazard wins. Red versus blue. Hazard wins. Versus blue. Red versus blue. Double mahu Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Hazard. Zidane versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Zinedine Zidane versus Hazard. Zidane versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Hazard. Zidane versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Come on, friends, like and subscribe my channel. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Subscribe. Or like. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Hazard versus Zidane. Hazard versus Zidane. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Hazard. Hazard score. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Hazard. Red versus blue. Zinedine Zidane wins. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Zidane versus next player. Rafinha. Zidane versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Come on, friends. Zidane versus Rafinha. Let's go. Zidane versus Rafinha. Rafinha versus Zidane. Come on, friends. Zidane versus Rafinha. Zidane versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Rafinha. Zidane versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Rafinha. Rafinha score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Rafinha. Zidane score. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Zidane versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Come on, friends. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Rafinha score. Rafinha wins. Red versus blue. Rafinha versus next player. Luka Modric. Luka Modric versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Luka Modric versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Luka Modric versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Luka red versus blue. Luka Modric score. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Luka Modric versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Luka Modric versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Luka Modric versus Rafinha. Luka Modric versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Luka Modric versus Rafinha. Red versus blue. Red versus blue. Luka Modric versus Rafinha. Luka Modric score. Red versus blue. Luka Modric wins. Red versus blue. Red versus blue.